Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm going to create a couple big holiday word cards using this big holiday words stamp and die set from Spellbinders. This is a set that I bought a year ago and then put it away for, well, this coming Christmas. Completely forgot about it until I found it the other day and wanted to make a couple cards before I forgot that I owned it again. So I have never used this stamp set before. So the first thing I do when I open up a stamp set to use it is I take a white eraser, and this is what I do with clear stamp sets. I don't necessarily do this with red rubber stamp sets because they don't often have the same issues as clear ones. So I take the white eraser and I rub it all over the stamping surface to remove any manufacturing residue, and it helps to take this or get the stamp ready to take ink. I don't even bother anymore testing the stamp to see if it'll take ink. I just automatically do this, and I do it to the entire set so that if I come back to the stamp set, I know that if I've used it once, I've done it to the entire set, I only have to do this one time. For my first card, I'm going to use some Spellbinders Watercolor Cardstock. Sorry, my mind went blank there. I have a piece that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, and I'm going to create the word joy, and I'm going to use the ornament stamp as the letter O for this particular card. For this one, I am going to stamp and emboss the entire word on the background, and I'm going to emboss it with some gold embossing powder. I thought the gold would look really pretty on the Spellbinders watercolor cardstock because it does have a bit of a creamy color to it. So I positioned everything on my Misti stamping tool. I like to do it with the Misti simply because with the grid lines, I can make sure that everything is nice and straight. I've also used some embossing powder tool on there just to make sure that my embossing powder is only going to stick to the VersaMark ink and it's not going to stick anywhere else on the cardstock. I do this a couple times because watercolor cardstock has some texture to it. I want to make sure to get as clear as of an impression as possible. And when it comes to stamping multiple times, I especially do it when it comes to VersaMark ink, simply because it's a little bit harder to see it on the background because it is tone on tone. So once that is completely done, I take that out of the Misti stamping tool, put it on a scrap piece of paper, and pour my embossing powder over top of it. Take the excess embossing powder, put it back into the jar. I love the fact that there's no waste when it comes to embossing powder. And then use my embossing tool to melt that powder on that background. Now I'm doing the whole word completely here. If you wanted, you could get a little bit of extra dimension by doing what I do with the second card, but I wanted to show two different ways of doing this. So once I have my whole piece here done, I'm just going to take my trimmer and I'm going to trim it down. Now I did the top part of the cardstock, but then when it came to the side, I went and I centered the hanging part of that ornament on the center part of what I wanted my cardstock piece to be. So when you see me having that paper hovering in the middle of my trimmer, that's what I'm doing. I'm making sure that I've got that ornament centered on the center part of the cardstock. Another thing that I sometimes like to do when it comes to creating and embossing is I take that VersaMark pad and I rub the edges of my cardstock in it, and then I dip it into some of the same embossing powder. This trims that cardstock in that gold embossing powder, but it's not a perfect trimming. It gives it a little bit more of a unique distressed look. It has that dimension of embossing, but you can see that it's not an even amount all the way around. I just like the way it looks. I can do that a second time if I want to, but just want to make sure that that embossing has cooled down and that that is completely embossed. Once I've done that a second time, I can melt those areas. And I will typically do it a second time if there is an area that got missed or if I want it to be a little bit heavier in one area than another. For this particular card, I'm going to use my distress refills and I'm going to use them to watercolor. And I'm only using two colors. I'm using Lumberjack Plaid and Tumbled Glass. I'm going to use both of them with the ornaments. I like the look of red and blue when it comes to Christmas cards, and I thought it would be beautiful on this one, especially because of the snowflake design in the center. I'm doing some very simple watercoloring here with this one because there's very little area to do the watercoloring in. So I have a water brush here that I have water in the handle. So when I am changing colors, all I have to do is squeeze my water brush on top of the paper towel that is to my right, and then that flushes the color out and I'm ready to go in with the next color. So the next color is the tumbled glass, and I'm trying to be darker around the outside edge and lighter towards the center. In order to add a little bit of extra color here, I'm going to add some silver, and I start to do that with a gel pen on the top of the ornament. Now my gel pen wanted to be a little bit stubborn on me, so I didn't really want to write too well, and sometimes that happens, especially if you have a room that's a little bit colder. So what I ended up doing instead, because I was also getting some pen marks because I was trying and I was pressing a little bit harder. So I took my Lisa Horton silver ink, smushed it onto my surface here, and then I used that to do the watercoloring of the top, and it worked perfectly. And then I thought it would be nice to use that behind the snowflake as well. So I just dipped my water brush, because it is water-soluble ink, and I watercolored behind that snowflake. And it's not super silver, you still see the embossing, but it adds that little bit of silver behind it. Once I let that dry for a little bit, now full disclosure, I didn't let it dry long enough because you can see what happened to the ornament on the bottom left-hand side. I used my ink blending brush and some tumbled glass distress ink to ink around, or to ink blend around the edges of the cardstock. But I'm going to show you here how I fix it. I take a clean water brush, use that on the ink that I have spread out, and then I use my paper towel to blot it up, and I get all of that ink removed. There's a tiny little bit of light red ink right below the Y there, but it's really hard to see, and without that smudge on the side of the ornament, I don't think anyone would really notice it. I think they would have to they'd be second guessing themselves whether they're seeing that or not. So I left that alone. I didn't want to mess with that, but the ornament part really needed to be fixed, and I wanted to share with you how to easily fix that. Once that had completely dried, I glued this to the card base. I just used a white card base, and then I used some crimson cardstock for my mat around it. My mat there is 5 1/4 inches by 4 inches. My card piece, my image piece that's embossed there, is 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And then the last step was I added a crystal mix gem to the center of that snowflake. I just love the additional dimension it gives, plus a little bit of sparkle. For my second card, I'm using some black watercolor cardstock. I thought it would look beautiful to do some embossing on that black background. So I'm putting the words or the letters down. This one I'm going to spell the word Noel, and I'm going to use the wreath for the letter O. But instead of stamping it right with the Noel, because you can see that I'm having a little bit of trouble fitting it all into my 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of cardstock there, I'm going to take that wreath or that O off, and I'm going to stamp and emboss that separately. Then I will die cut it because there's dies in this set as well, and I will use it as a dimensional element on there. So I have the N and the E and the L on my piece of cardstock, and that O was necessary, that wreath was necessary just to leave enough space there. But I can adjust these letters to make sure that they're centered in the card, to make sure that they're nice and lined up. And I'm really using the grid lines on the top of, or on the clear part of my Misti, just to make sure that that is totally straight and totally lined up. And you can see that I go back and forth a couple times just to make sure that everything is straight and lined up. Because once you're stamping and embossing, you can't rearrange those letters. So you might as well take your time to rearrange them ahead of time. Once I have those rearranged properly and I like the way that they are sitting, I'm going to use that same VersaMark pad that I used for the first card, but this time I'm going to emboss it with silver embossing powder. I use the embossing powder tool on here just like I did for the first card. Again, I really want that embossing powder to only stick to my ink, and I'm going to stamp this again multiple times just to make sure that I have a really nice and clear image here. Now, I'm doing this one silver only to make it different from my first card, but you could easily do it with gold as well, and it would look absolutely gorgeous because gold on black looks stunning as well. So once that is stamped and I'm happy with the stamping, I can put my embossing powder on there. The excess just goes onto the scrap piece of cardstock and then gets put right back into the jar. And then I can use my heat tool to emboss that and to heat that. So this same design would work exactly the same, would work well on the light colored watercolor cardstock as well. I just wanted to show you the difference, or the card with both a light background and a dark background. And same with Noel working on the light, that Joy design would work well on the dark as well. Next, I want to stamp and emboss that wreath. And if I had a scrap of black watercolor cardstock that was big enough, I would have used that. but I didn't. So I just used another piece that I had. I'm just stamping it as close to the corner as possible so that I can still use the rest of that piece there. I'm going to stamp it multiple times, and then I'm going to emboss it with that gold embossing powder to match the letters on my background. Now I'm using, sorry, I said gold, I meant silver. I'm using the silver embossing powder here, but I think it would also look gorgeous done with a green or a green metallic embossing powder. A green sparkle embossing powder would look beautiful as well. Once that is embossed and ready to go, I'm going to use some Cloud9 interference ink pads, and I'm choosing the color based on what color it looks like on dark cardstock or black cardstock. So this is the Lavender Fields. You can see the purple on the left side of the pad and green on the right. The purple side of the pad is what it looks like on light cardstock. So when you see it smushed on my surface, that's why you see purple here. Now I watercolored that and then let it to dry. And to be honest, it ended up having a little bit more of a silvery green tone than it did green. So I ended up redoing it off screen, and I will show you the difference in just a moment. Once I have that watercolored, I can let that dry. But because I had to go out and do some errands, there was something else I wanted to let dry as well. I wanted to have some red berries made with stickles, so I'm just putting that on there so that the ink, the watercolor ink, as well as the stickles can all dry at the same time. Now, typically, if I was home all day, I would do my watercoloring first and then do my stickles once that was dry. But because I was going out, there's no harm in doing it all at once. So I put my berries on there, and this particular stamp has areas that have berries drawn in, and I just used those and then filled a few extra ones in. So here are the two pads that I used. I ended up going back over with ripe mango interference ink, and then realized I probably should show you the difference of the two on top of just the black cardstock. So I'm just painting them on that black cardstock. So that first one there was the Lavender Fields. This one is the ripe mango, and you can see that the ripe mango has a little bit of a yellow orange look on the white there, but that's not what you're going to see. You're going to see more of the green, and I will show it a little bit closer once it has dried. These interference inks, especially on the dark cardstock, they need to sit and dry because that interference will come to the surface as they dry. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm just matching up the dies that come with the stamp set so that I can die cut that wreath out. So once I have them in place, I tape them in place just to make sure they're not going to shift as I'm doing my die cutting, and I can put them through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine to die cut that wreath out. And then I'm going to put it onto my card. So here is the watercolor. The bottom color there is that Lavender Fields, and you can see it has a little bit more of a silver tone, but the top one is the ripe mango. It has more of that green tone to it, which you see better with that silver embossing. And really the first color would have worked if I wanted a more silvery green look to it, but I really wanted the green to show up with that silver embossing. So I really prefer the ripe mango. So just because you don't like the first color that turned up doesn't mean you can't go over it with a second one. Once all of that is done, I can assemble my card. And I'm using some fern cardstock for my background here, and I am putting that Noel piece on top of it. So my fern cardstock is trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. The Noel piece is trimmed down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches, and then I can put my wreath on. And I'm just using some foam pop dots to help that pop up a little bit. You can glue it down flat, but because we have a separate piece anyways, that dimension is a really nice addition. In this set, there's also a bow die. There's no stamp to go with it, so you can just die cut it. And I just die cut it out of a scrap of crimson cardstock to add that dimension to the bow and that focal point. And then because my background was a little bit plain, shall we say, I decided to also add a bow made with silver cord. You could also add, let's say, like a string hanging that wreath up. I think that would look nice as well. However, I would do that before assembling that piece onto my card background instead. I just used the same Barely Art glue to glue that together. That's the same thing that I glue everything together with. And then I will let that dry completely. It will dry perfectly, but you do need to give it a little moment. So there is the finished card. You can see the designs are very, very simple, but I really love the boldness of those words with the ornament and the wreath for the O's in both words. So these are really quick cards to put together. I used embossing in this, but you could also use colored ink for the background as well. If you wanted to just have them solid without embossing, that would work as well. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.